Hi, everybody, and welcome to week one and to our discussion of this fascinating interview between Iris Murdoch and Brian McGee in the 1978 BBC television show Men of Ideas. In the UK in 1978, it would have felt a lot less surprising than perhaps it does now for a woman to be interviewed on a show called Men of Ideas, and indeed for both the interviewer and interviewee to proceed by talking as if all thinkers are men throughout the interview. It was a different era, of course, in many ways. And the voices, the accents are also, I think, part of that. And the whole demeanor and self-presentation of these folks, I think, would be worthy of several dissertations all by itself. But our particular interest is going to be with what they say. That is our text for this week, this discussion between these two people. Just to very briefly sketch out who they are, Iris Murdoch is a renowned philosopher trained in Oxford, and later in her life became a renowned novelist and published a lot of novels that are very successful, both commercially and well received critically. Brian McGee is the host of this show, is more of a sort of public intellectual figure, in some ways a sort of precursor or forerunner of contemporary popular philosophers. He was trained in philosophy himself, and he interviewed a lot of different kinds of thoughtful people or men of ideas for this BBC show. And it sort of belongs to a tradition of public intellectualism that was a sort of a strand in UK culture, certainly from roughly the 40s, 50s, 60s through to the 70s, and kind of dropped out a little bit and later in the 80s. This week's discussion, I'm hoping that we can chat about a few of the major themes that pop out from this interview right at the beginning, at least for me. And you see this straight away with McGee saying, and I have the quote written down here so we get this right, "If a philosopher writes well, it's little more than a bonus. It makes him more enticing to study, obviously, but it does nothing to make him a better philosopher." So one of our key questions here is going to be whether that's true. Is there nothing added to the quality of a philosopher's philosophy by the quality of their writing? And let's set aside the huge cans of worms about what we mean by quality in either case. Is he right to say that it's just irrelevant whether one's a, quotes, good writer? And I think then under that heading, several of the other big issues that come up in that interview can kind of formulate themselves. So, for example, when Iris Murdoch says, when one's writing philosophy, one's writing something which is very much more like science than it's like literature. That you could see how, if McGee's first comment was right, that might be true, right? So being a great writer might be not particularly relevant to whether or not you are a great scientist. And so if philosophy is like science, you can see where that thought is going, that being a great writer doesn't necessarily make you any better at it. And then when you get claims like Murdoch's claim that philosophy aims to clarify, whereas literature, whatever its aims are, they are multifarious and typically different from that. you can see again how if all you want to do is clarify things, maybe being a great writer is pretty irrelevant for doing that. Although some might say there's actually a very distinct kind of high quality writing that is required for being very clear. So this does get then complicated with respect to that question of what quality writing, good writing, consists in, because if writing very clearly is one way of being a good writer, and philosophy aims to clarify, then again you can see where that thought is going. Then being a good writer will make you a better philosopher, presumably, or at least a better explainer of your philosophy. Maybe we could put it that way. So there's a first bundle of ideas we can talk about. I mean, at some point, we're going to have conversations about things like, what does it mean to call something philosophy? What does it mean to call something literature? Those are both, issues that are going to come up here. They're both questions to which Murdoch and McGee do address themselves in the interview. And they have thoughts about them that we may or may not be impressed by. There's also a separate question from either of those, which is, what does it mean to call a piece of literature philosophical? So suppose we know what literature is and we know what philosophy is. What does it take to be a philosophical piece of literature? Sort of a third question. Under this heading, I want to frame a lot of other sorts of smaller questions about things like, well, what is the role of the author's intention, for example? Does it matter if the author was trying to write a philosophical novel? Can one write a philosophical novel by accident, as it were, because your novel turned out to be philosophical, although you didn't realize it, you didn't intend it to be? What does it take besides authorial intent, if anything, to make a novel a philosophical one or a non-philosophical one? These are all questions that are also looming, and indeed, again, they do get into that in this conversation, at least a little bit, around about the stage in the discussion where Murdoch says that the only good philosophical novel is Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, which is the novel that we'll be reading later in this course, along with one of Murdoch's own. So her inclination is to say that a good novel is typically, including her own, is typically not a piece of philosophical literature, because it's not a piece of philosophy. Philosophy is aiming to do something pretty different from what a piece of literature is trying to do. And so, that raises all those questions about what is it really that philosophy and literature are trying to do. These are huge questions. We're not going to solve any of these, of course, but I think they're fascinating ones to have on the table, sort of framing the rest of what we're going to be doing this term. Other kinds of questions that might be relevant here would be things like, how does the author, not necessarily their intention with respect to a particular book, let's say, but maybe how they identify. Do they call themselves a philosopher? Does that matter? Is a book written by someone who says, no, I'm not a philosopher, but it looks like a very philosophical book, can it then be a work of philosophy even though the person doesn't think that they're a philosopher? Some of Simone de Beauvoir's work might be interesting under that heading, because she didn't like to use the term philosopher to describe herself. So there's a whole bunch of questions there, and subheadings as well underneath the question of what philosophy is, like questions like, well, how much is it like science? How much is it like the kind of Western philosophical tradition that Murdoch and McGee are talking about in this interview? What other kinds of philosophy could there be? Do they have anything in common with that conception? And there's also a part of the discussion where Murdoch talks about how literature is all about masks and roles and voicing stories. And so there's this key question about how the work of Plato then fits into the literature versus philosophy classification, because a lot of Plato's work is about masks and roles and the telling of stories. And as, again, they both say in their discussion, the kinds of Western philosophical tradition they're interested in is very much a descendant of Plato's work and his time, his environment, and the questions that he raised. And Murdoch goes so far as to agree with that comment from Whitehead about how the entire history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, which is a pretty extreme claim. Presumably, though, the footnotes don't have to resemble the original text, so perhaps Plato's literature and the subsequent discipline of philosophy, the footnotes, are not. That is a consistent point of view anyway. Whether it's the truth, quite a different question. When it comes to things like what literature is, again, a little subset of questions like, are we including only highbrow stuff, like Iris Murdoch novels, or is lowbrow, maybe like contemporary song lyrics, let's say, does that count as literature as well? What about episodes of Star Trek, something else we're going to be looking at later in this course? And we are going to have a lot of questions that are typically asked in aesthetics more generally, like what kind of thing counts as art? So I think that Murdoch says somewhere in the interview that we know what literature is, right? It's art using words. It's an art form with words. So is really bad art still art? Is lowbrow art real art? These are questions that we're going to have to engage with under this as a subset of questions underneath the question of what literature is. And then, of course, who decides? Who gets to make those kinds of calls? It seems very clear that Brian McGee has a lot of opinions about who is and isn't a good writer, for example, at the beginning of the interview, and he just states them as if it was obvious and everyone would totally agree with him. So does he, does he get to decide? Does he have the authority to make those kinds of calls? I don't really feel like he does, but we can ask ourselves what it would take to be a good writer, a good philosopher, as well as asking ourselves the question of what a philosopher is, what literature is. Oh, actually, I did want to say one more thing on the topic of bad writing. So part of what I'm doing with this course and thinking about the analysis of texts that could be considered philosophical is trying to think about how we could use up those analyses to inform our own creative writing. And so when it comes to types of bad art, bad writing, one of the things I'm going to be keeping in mind, or trying to keep in mind throughout this course, is how to spot them, how to avoid them, how to avoid sort of replicating these types of errors ourselves in our writing, how to get past some of the great cliches and some of the, when you're watching a TV show where there's a very obvious philosophical point being made and you're just being hammered over the head with it, how do we avoid doing things like that and instead write something that maybe even Iris Murdoch could consider to be a great story that still has philosophical content in some sense. So we're going to be thinking about bad writing from that point of view, not just out of pure interest in what it is. Okay, so coming back to our text, our interview, as you're watching, as you're listening to this, I would suggest listening out for things like, what do they think philosophy is? What are they taking it to be? And what do they think literature is? What kind of examples do they use? And how do they convey their sense of what assumptions they're making? Maybe things that they don't say out loud, but are clearly assumed as being in the common ground between them about what philosophy is and what literature is. Listen out for that. I would also recommend listening out for every time they talk about humor or the role of humor or fun in literature and in philosophy, entertainment and things like that. And maybe also for when they talk about whether literature or philosophy are natural. Anytime the word natural comes up, that always gets my philosopher brain immediately interested. That's a very interesting word, natural. And what do we mean? What do they mean by it in this context when they say something is or isn't, quotes, natural? And how does it get applied to this discussion about the relationship between philosophy and literature? So keep your eyes or ears open for that as well. And then, I mean, another sort of framing question that I guess I'll leave you with, and then everyone can go and watch the interview. Does this interview itself count as a philosophical conversation? Is there some philosophy happening on that stage or in front of those cameras? And if so, why? And if not, why not? Okay, so that was a huge ramble, big bundle of questions there. You don't have to answer them, any of them. You don't have to address any of them specifically. Really, what I'm doing with them is trying to give you a sense of the range of what's kind of on the table here or what's on the agenda for our conversations this week. As far as the discussion threads go, what I'm going to do is I think because those quotes are so rich, I'm just going to take a few of those quotes directly from Murdoch and maybe that McGee quote, and I will use those to open the discussion threads and then have people weigh in on what they think about those and how they might reply or expand upon or challenge what McGee and Murdoch say. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. As always, I'll be available Wednesday and Friday, 2 to 3 p.m. for my office hours. And if you have any email questions, please feel free to email Jelena, our TA, and I will see you back on Friday for the wrap-up.